I'm really delighted to introduce Rupert Clark, the Lead Officer for Transport for the South East, who is chairing our next session, Delivering in a Constrained World. Rupert, over to you.
Good morning. Thank you, Naomi. How nice to hear from the Minister. I was thinking about the sweating of the assets, and those of you that know the A27 South Coast Corridor and can imagine a desiccated lemon, that is certainly an asset that has been sweated. So we've got a fantastic panel for you here this morning. Really excited, given the point that the Minister made about being in a constrained environment and some of the the inevitable fiscal discipline that we're going to have to live with. So I'm going to invite up our fantastic panel. I'll bring back Andy Rind, Deputy Director from the DfT for Regional Partnerships and Delivery. And here comes David Ogden, Operations Director for COLAS, and Claire Sheffield, Director of Transport Planning from Arup, and Chikasta Pritlove, Head of Transport UK Public Sector for Google Cloud. And you just, it's just a fantastic lineup, this, isn't it? You've got a bit of policy, you've got a bit of delivery, you've got some transport planning-y stuff, and you've got the topic of the moment, really, isn't it? When you think about every day for the last week in the news, there's always been something about AI, but that sort of disruptor, the enabler that new technology can bring. I had a bit of a think about delivering in a constrained world, and I did a bit of. It's brilliant, isn't it? The thesaurus on Microsoft Word, and you stick in constraint, and it came back with restraint, limitation, control, check, and constriction. And I was just thinking about what the Minister said about the importance of transport in the way that as STBs, if you go back to the legislation where we all sort of hold up as our little Bible, it's about how do we use transport to facilitate economic growth while having regard to environment and social issues. And a constriction on transport is going to be quite challenging because it's the things that people need to get to work, to get healthcare, to get education, to access those amazing green spaces that we have around the country. So a constriction or a limitation or restraint doesn't necessarily support our communities. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. We know that the financial world is tricky. And we are living this every day, aren't we? Inflation, the cost of borrowing, that sort of general cost of living. I can't believe how much my Ocado shop is a week nowadays. And there are these sort of finite resources that we have. And there are other constraints around us. The future of artificial intelligence, and we've had debates in the past, haven't we, at these kinds of events about connected vehicles and autonomous, and how can that drive efficiencies, give a better offer for the travelling public. And then, of course, there's this massive constraint that we can't really stop, and that's this sort of climate stuff that's heading towards us. And now you could argue we should see that as an opportunity. And we don't really know how much of that is short-term. So you heard the Minister talk about the Prime Minister's aim of bringing down inflation or halving inflation. So how much of this is short-term, and how much are we just going to have to, someone said to me earlier, it feels a bit like 2010 in terms of, the financial constraint that's going to be upon us. Those of you from local authorities know that was a decade of austerity and cuts, and, we're going to drop a few libraries and close some waste sites and reduce transport spend. So, are we entering this kind of world? And in which case, how do we, as the professionals that are tasked with improving the life of our communities, what are we going to do about it? So, I might go to my panel after that little intro, and I'm sort of asking them to just think about, well, okay, we see what's on the horizon. How are we in our own organisation starting to think about how we might deal with that sort of constraint? And I think I'm going to ask Andy first, as the policy maker, the voice and the ear of ministers. So let's hear from the DfT the sorts of things that they're thinking about.
So as you heard from the Minister earlier, thank you, Rupert, LTP guidance is coming out. Now, I'm old enough to remember LTP guidance number 1 coming out, and one of my first jobs in the DfT was actually marking LTPs that local authorities had written, marking the road safety sections, and it was a point system, and it all funneled down to an award at the end, and that. And actually, it's going back to that basic principle of understanding your communities, understanding the economy, understanding the other objectives that you've got in terms of levelling up, and planning transport's role in that. I was joking with Martin Tugwell earlier on that, as a transport planner, the first thing you're ever told is transport's only the fallout from people being in the wrong place at the right time. But actually, it's really, really important, isn't it? Even in a post-pandemic world where we've seen the minister on the screen, and the need to travel is reduced, but people still need to travel. This conference wouldn't be the same if we weren't all in the room. I think in terms of what the DFT will be looking for, Rupert, as well as that solid foundation of planning, which, of course, all of the STBs have already done for their regions. You've all got strategic transport plans in place, and indeed programs of investment set out. It'll be about case making. It'll be about focusing on the user and outcomes rather than infrastructure and inputs necessarily. So really thinking about what's the change that you're trying to make and how might that best be achieved. Doubtless, innovative funding solutions will be part of it. I'm sure that's right. And you heard the minister say more than once and loud and clear, providing choice to users, I think, will be increasingly important as well.
Thank you, Andy. Well, let me bring in Claire. So from a transport planning world with Arup, what are the sort of things that you're thinking about in this constrained world? And we don't know whether it's short or long term. What's running through your mind?
Yeah, I think similarly, really, to Andy, I would say that a key risk in a constrained environment, and we're facing, as you said, multiple constraints, both the funding constraints, but also the challenge of the drop in demand. We don't know how long-term that is, but it's making even some of our kind of previous banker schemes so much more difficult to make the case for, and it's created huge revenue holes for a lot of organisations, as well as the challenge of climate. And I think there's a huge temptation amongst organisations to kind of hunker down in such a challenging environment, just really focus on the day-to-day, on getting things done, on getting through your programme. But actually, I would say, as a strategy specialist, I would say that it's actually never more important than in a constrained environment to focus on strategy, to really be thinking about exactly what it is you're trying to achieve, and not that just kind of that sort of strategy which is just a series of nice things that everybody wants to deliver, but really difficult strategic decisions that are about saying, well, okay, if we want these 5 things, what are we prepared to sacrifice? What do we want the most? What, really looking at prioritising, working both politically and on the officer side to really understand what it is you're trying to deliver, and then absolutely embed that through everything you do in the organisation so that every bit of your constrained time and resource is spent on delivering those priorities and making the right things happen, because there's just no room for waste. And I think that, for us as an organisation, working with you, it's very much about, from our point of view, really helping you to develop those strategic priorities and working together and working from our side as lean and efficiently as we can to kind of deliver with you collectively those priorities.
So you've had a couple of thoughts there from Andy and Claire. Do put it onto the Slido. Let's get some. Let's generate some conversation on Slido. Chester, thinking about Google and this constrained world, are you feeling anything within the organisation, or do you see actually this might be an opportunity to support Andy, Claire and David in delivering in a constrained world? How is it playing out with you?
Absolutely, we see opportunities to support both local authorities and the sub-national transport bodies and the department itself. In fact, we do work with the Department for Transport, and all of the transport data is on Google Cloud, and that analytics that we're able to bring is helping the department to make those hard policy choices that Claire was talking about. I think it's fantastic to hear Andy talking about focusing on the user, because if you read Google's 10 philosophies, 10 things we know to be true. The first one is focus on the user, and everything else will follow. And for us, that means being able to deliver a service that customers need and want. So just to give you an example of how that plays out, when we're developing Google Search, it's our problem if a customer cannot spell the word that they're looking for. So we have to make customer problems our own. We have to own those problems, and then we have to deliver on them. And the way we do that is to take what Claire was saying and take those priorities and say, right, what do we actually want to deliver? What is actually going to deliver value? And then we work in tandem with our customers and our engineering teams to focus on those problems and focus on those users. And that's what we think we can bring from a data perspective and a skills perspective into the local authorities and the subnational transport bodies. We know there is a rarity of digital skills within the public sector, and so that's something that we're actively working with DDAT and the government to do, is to build innovation programs to help the public sector gain those digital skills so that you can start using data in a meaningful way.
Thank you, thank you. And David, from a, you've got the teams that are effectively building the stuff that has come through policy, through transport planning. How are you as an organisation, how are you dealing with constraint, and what opportunities do you see, and what sort of impacts might it be having with you?
So first of all, morning everybody, and World Environmental Day today, Rupert.
Just going to come on to that.
So just a reminder for us all. But it's been interesting to listen to the conversation actually, because when in the delivery space, when I think about the constraints and the things that we're considering across people, planet, productivity, and how they fit into the wicked issues that are already in our sector, that are already challenging ourselves with around social impact and value, around climate and decarbonisation, again, and the skills and diversity piece. It's already been mentioned, Claire, you mentioned it just now, about the issue around hyperinflation and all of the issues around that that's been created in the short term have been a real challenge for the sector to manage on both the public and the private side. We're having to completely reevaluate some of the decisions that we've already made, some of the ones that we're planning to make, some of the programs that are being considered. And that's caused some short-term challenge around utilisation of resources, some commercial tensions, some uncertainty within the sector, undoubtedly. But I think to see the opportunity within that, and there is quite a significant however to that, is that what I'm also personally seeing, and it's again been mentioned today about the Transport for the North Connecting Communities and the interim SRN report recently published by National Highways, is that there's a real maturity in the narrative around the consideration and the need to make decisions with a broader lens. And that piece around, again, people, planet, productivity coming together, perhaps different language around social environment, outcomes that need to be looked at. And we've been doing some work with Deal and Exeter University, for example, on donut economics and how that can be applied within the private sector. But it's just really interesting that I'm seeing the alignment of the sector across both the public and the private, thinking about that broader lens, and therefore the challenge is the short term is causing some problems. And we have to do that together. We have to work through that together. But the medium to long term vision and the alignment, I think, looks positive.
Good. Well, that's good to hear, isn't it? I mean, I think, undoubtedly there are challenging times ahead, but as you guys just said, it's an opportunity as well. And, for STBs, the key for our transport strategies is the evidence base. Really, really strong evidence. And, quite often we have these discussions about, well, what happens if politicians change and governments change and so on and so forth. But the evidence base is the thing that keeps us all together. And holding on to that, so the analytical work, I think, is key. I mean, I suppose, have we got it right in a way? Sometimes when we think about, well, what's transport for? Are we, do we have a coherent and strong view on how transport enables things and supports people? I mean, I'd be interested in your views. Perhaps I'll go to Claire first.
Yeah, sure. I think I would say that the last decade has been a story in kind of increasing complexity in our understanding of what transport is for. I joined the transport industry 20 years ago, and I think we were pretty focused on, getting people from A to B. It was all about congestion and crowding and sort of some pretty infrastructure. And over the last decade or so, our concept of what transport is about has got so much broader. We're increasingly talking about climate, obviously, about air quality and wider environment, but we're also talking about placemaking, about how the way that we design our transport really sets the vision for how our cities actually operate, how it defines the way that we live our lives, and also about the opportunity for transport to unlock growth. I mean, there's so much innovative work being done in the subnational transport bodies on that topic of how, investing in transport really delivers opportunities for development, both jobs and homes. And really understanding that kind of broader role for transport. I've not mentioned health. Again, there's been so many different angles that we've had to look at. That's hugely challenging for us as an industry. It means bringing in different skills, wider skills. I saw a question down there about how do we make sure that we've got the skills that we need. And I think that's a really interesting challenge. It's certainly something that we're grappling with as ARIPA as an organisation, to make sure that we've really got that breadth of skills and that we draw together all of our colleagues from across different sectors. Increasingly in transport, we can't just work in our bubble. We're having to work with land use planners, with health professionals, across the piece. So I think that we've got quite a challenge as to what transport is for, because it's for a lot of things. Transport is really at the heart of our lives, and that is why we need to be really, really clear about what we're trying to achieve. And fundamentally, that's about having a vision for our places and building our transport out from there, rather than starting in perhaps our old-fashioned way with what modes we're looking at, what networks we've got. So that's how I would see it.
The land use planning, I mean, it's quite a challenge, isn't it? That, been a historical disconnect between transport planning and land use planning. And, it does beg the question, doesn't it? You heard the Minister say, actually, you've got STBs, really, really sound evidence base, speaking with a single voice, on transport for the South East perspective. That's 16 local transport authorities pulling together and saying, these are the priorities for our region. We haven't quite got the 11 million, Maria, but we're getting there, 8 million odd people. So, using that model, getting the political buy-in, what's the opportunity? So if we think about, and this isn't a hark back to 2010 and regional spatial strategies and all the rest of it, but actually got a model that works. And if you can bring that together, potentially local planning authorities having to have regard to the evidence base that STBs produce could be quite helpful in the point that you flag. Let's bring in Andy. Let's bring a bit of policy into the world. So, what's transport for? Have we got it right? How important is that evidence base? Have we got strong views?
I think, as Claire said, and I'm someone who left the transport planning industry about 20 years ago to join the civil service, so it was much more straightforward in my day. You kind of predicted and you provided, and we had these huge models that kind of were based on historical data. And all of that's changed now, as Claire said. So I think it has to do all of the things that Claire very eloquently described. And the question is, how do we prioritize, I think, and what are the objectives that we prioritize against nationally and regionally? And I think that's where the challenge comes. Clearly driving the economy is important, but driving the economy may not be all about widening and building roads anymore. It might be enabling businesses to make choices based on better information and more predictable journey times through technology. It might be about load sharing and freight. It's about thinking, I think, more carefully and more deeply about the problem. We've always been very provider-led in the transport industry, whatever mode we're in. And I think what the STBs can do is to cut across that and bring a level of granularity that enables the right schemes to surface at the right time and those cases to be made.
Thanks, Andy. And you can get the debate going. So if you're on to Slido and got on there, great. If you haven't, it's STBC23. STBC23. David.
Yeah, thanks very much. I was just going to come in and just say that, you know, my God, we've been through some nonsense together, haven't we, for the last few years? I mean, who would have thought some of the things that we've had to deal with together? But again, as a sector, what's a great thing is we never waste a good crisis, do we? And it's been shown again, and I think for me, just again, listening to the conversation around me, we're in a period of transformation, which is exciting, isn't it? You know, I mentioned earlier, one of the problems we've got as a sector, a wicked issue, is attracting and retaining skills and diversity in the sector. Well, we've got a period now where who knows what all the solutions are going to be, but we're working out together. I mean, what a thing to be attracting people into our sector with. You know, the ability to look back in 20 years' time and say, I was part of that. You know, what's going on at the moment is innovation, isn't it? It's creative. It's lots of different things being done and tried, and will all of it work? No, of course not, but that's an innovative environment, isn't it? And I just think from my perspective, from transport, that, you know, back to the points that were being made earlier around connecting communities, enabling public health, the way in which we use our places, it enables things to look different. And I just think we're in a period now where we're all personally and professionally thinking differently. And we have to do it, again, to the point, we have to do this together, end to end, work it out, regardless of who's responsible for what. But let's get creative again. It's what we're good at as a sector, so we should do more of it.
Thank you. And Shikasta, from your perspective, thinking about transport and how we do transport with the knowledge of your data and analytics, how do you see it from your perspective? Do you think we understand? I'd loved your bit about the user. You know, how many times do you type into Google and you've misspelt something and magically it takes you to the right page? You know, how do you see it from your perspective?
So I think a lot of it is, as David said, I think innovation is absolutely key, and I think it is a really exciting time. I think innovation, however, needs to have a focus, and that takes you back to what Claire was saying. You need to have what in Google we call moonshots. So you need to have that vision of how you're going to get to the moon. And everybody needs to agree on that vision, and then everybody needs to work towards that vision. What I would say, to pick up on what David was saying, is that as a sector, I think we just need to be a bit braver about trying new things. And we need to move away from this idea that something failing is bad. Failure isn't bad because you're learning all the time, and it's what is a failure is when you don't take heedance of that learning. So to try stuff, to try new things, to try new ways of working, and to learn from those, and to just continue to build that learning. If the way we work at Google, you'll see we have a company called X who do our big moonshots. Yeah. One of the most famous was that we were trying to get Wi-Fi to remote areas across the globe using hot air balloons. That closed down. It didn't work. But what did work was the learnings that we took from that, which are now going into other projects in Google that will end up delivering something like that, just not necessarily through balloons. So it's really about just embracing failure, learning to work within that, and taking those learnings. And I think that could be really, really huge for the transport industry if we can actually master how to do that and how to run these innovation projects and then how to scale them. And that's a whole other area.
It's a really interesting proposition for us, isn't it? Taking the moonshot, taking the risk, doing things, trying new things, and accepting that, you know, a number of those things might fail, but you learn from it. And I've just, as you were talking there, I was just trying to think about how might that play out in a political environment. And I was just thinking about the condition of the road network for local authority colleagues, potholes, flavour of the day. It's all right for you, Nick. You get millions and millions and millions. And, you know, would my politicians, would my members, would they embrace the failure of the road? there's a cultural shift, I think, that we have to go through. And we can learn from you and organisations like you, I think, in how you get your board accepting of, look, you've got to try these things, otherwise you won't know.
And a lot of that is around the data. So, we have all of these projects, but we don't just spin them up just because we think it's a great idea. We have to go to our management with incredibly robust business cases to say why we think this is going to happen, what's going to happen, what we think the outcomes are going to be. And it goes back to what Andy was talking about. It is about outcomes. What is the outcome going to be? And how can we prove that actually by doing X, Y, and Z is going to deliver those outcomes? And that's where data and analytics comes into that, because every decision that is made at Google is made based on data. And that's why it's so important to every industry, but in particular to the transport industry, because there are huge elements of the transport sectors who don't have the data to be able to make those informed decisions. You've got Network Rail as an example, who are trying to run this huge network of increasing complexity, but yet don't have a view of who their passengers actually are. And the same for National Highways, who are doing a fantastic job trying to get to know their customer with the Digital for Customer program is fantastic, because they know that they need to understand who their customers are in order to deliver a service that is actually valuable to their customers. So I think there is huge movements towards that in the transport sector, and I applaud it, and I will support it as much as I possibly can with the data and the analytics capabilities that we have within Google Cloud.
And that chimes quite nicely with STBs, the evidence base, the solid evidence base, the importance of data, the importance of that analysis to enable decision makers to make those decisions and take those risks. So just moving on a bit and thinking about the role of STBs and the relationships with subnational transport bodies and delivery supply chains. Perhaps David, I might come to you first. How do you think you can help STBs achieve those long-term ambitions? So, if I take my strategic investment plan, it's 45 billion quid over the next 30 years. How can the supply chain, if you like, help turning those strategies into reality?
So I think it comes back to, I love the phrase moonshot, by the way, I'm going to keep that one. But giving that visibility, that engagement, acting as the integrator, the enabler, and providing the broader sector that visibility of that moon view is important. It helps us make decisions, helps us understand where we can add value, but equally and as importantly, where we can't. So it's really important, I think, as we go through this period again, to work together in that way, Rupert, just to get that vision, that visibility, that understanding. Let's work together and see how no single organisation, either public or private, large or small, can do this on their own.
We're in it together.
We're in it together. Yeah, we have to do this together, and the STBs are playing a great role in providing that visibility and connecting the stakeholders. And again, I just think we need more of that continued effort, continued focus, and we will generate some fantastic outcomes together.
Claire, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think obviously it's something we think a lot about, is how we can work, as you say, David, in partnership together. We're seeing an increasingly constrained world in our clients where people are taking on larger and larger remits. They're, hugely challenging in terms of the amount of time that they've got to devote to projects as well as budgets. And as someone has commented down here, a huge issue for local authorities in terms of being able to retain the staff that they need. You've got teams just doing fantastic jobs across the country in incredibly constrained environments. And I think what we've been looking at is how we can bring our resources to really help that. And we've looked at that in a number of ways. One thing that we're increasingly seeing is authorities contracting their work in a different way, so bringing things together into more of a strategic package. And I think that that's something that we really welcome, and I think that's probably shared across our competitors in the sector, as a view that by bringing things together and being able to work more in partnership with you over a longer period of time, it's a really efficient use of resources on both sides, sort of rather than that kind of constant you know, constant cycle of procurement of small projects. And I think it really helps us to understand what you need and really deliver a higher quality outcome and just provides that resource support. So that's one thing that we're doing. Another thing that we've really been looking at is our ability to use our sort of unique funding model, because Arup is employee owned. It means that we can devote resource to research and development. And so one of the things we're really looking at is how we can develop sort of tools and processes that really are there for you as a kind of off-the-shelf product, so that it just becomes cheaper and easier to do these kind of strategic tasks that we all have in common as something that we all need to do. So, for example, the agent-based modelling work that we're doing with Transport East at the moment is about looking at ways of delivering really sophisticated modelling, but that can be done cheaper and quicker. So sort of cheaper, quicker, better, really, is what we're aiming at with that. In this sort of environment. So there's a lot of different things that we're trying to look at to really facilitate that kind of innovation within the constrained environment that we're all working under.
David, did you want to come in?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to come in and add to what Claire said there about visibility and R&D and innovation. Again, it's connecting us with the conversation at the right point. And you know, within the R&D space, the team within our organisation, you know, they're working on 20, 25-year horizons, and therefore hearing from yourselves what the challenges are, what the problems are, is really important, you know, because it's got a lot more credibility, frankly, than me saying it to them. You know, so coming from yourselves and really understanding what the problems are that you're trying to solve, you know, as early as you are looking at them. You know, and bring us in at that point, because that's where we've got skills, capabilities, experience across the sector, public and private, coming together and really unpicking the problems and understanding where the solutions can come from.
Well, let me take us on to money in our last few minutes. I want to also have a look at some Slido comments as well. So it's a big question about, okay, if we're entering into this period of constraint, you know, where might the money come from? I mean, this is a great one for Andy to start off with, isn't it? But you know, what are the opportunities? Public, private, finance, funding. You know, Andy, where do you see it going?
I think we're in the market for all of those things, Rupert. I mean, I can remember looking after the roads programme, National Roads Programme in 2010, and we managed to get a number of schemes back into that programme with either local contribution or developer contribution, where those schemes got development away. I think one of the things that STBs can do that government perhaps isn't that good at, because we're operating at too high a level, is having conversations with the private sector about how funding might come forward and what would need to be true for that funding to come forward. And I know that's something that you're particularly active in Transport for the South East. So I think, you know, it's never easy. It's the holy grail. You know, the minister, we've had successions of ministers who've been extremely keen on, you know, where's the private contribution, where's the local contribution towards this scheme. It's not always easy to mobilise, but I think we have to look ever harder at it in the current environment.
So I suppose the question for all of us, isn't it? What would make transport infrastructure more attractive to private funding? And like Andy says, what needs to be true in order to attract alternative forms of investment? Because the developer contribution, I think, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's relatively small. Everybody's got a claw on it, haven't they? How do you really attract in that private investment? Panel, any thoughts? Go on, David.
Go on, jump in, sorry. I suppose I was just going to say, we've got to remember that the transport infrastructure sector and services is a global business, and therefore there's global opportunities for organisations to invest in that type of infrastructure and service. And therefore, we're blessed. We're in the UK, so we're part of an economy that is seen globally attractive to invest into, but so is North America, so is Canada, so is Australia. You know, so it then comes down to the individual schemes that are being discussed, comes back to the conversation earlier about the visibility, the understanding, the opportunity, the discussion around risk and reward, a political will to have a model around PPP that we probably don't have a fully functioning PPP market in the UK right now. So again, that's something we need to work on together, because there is opportunity there, but there's also competition in the space for that investment. So how do we collectively, and part of my role within what I do day to day is convincing the global business to invest in the UK. So let's work together and help me build those business cases and give different options and work through the solutions together again.
Claire?
Yeah, I think for me, where the STBs are really crucial in that is that the only way that we're going to bring kind of more substantive money into the sector is by working at a larger scale. So whilst we're working piecemeal development by development, it's always going to be, little bits everyone's battling. And I think that thinking more at a more of a regional scale gives us the opportunity to look strategically, bring all those development opportunities together and say, well, strategically overall in this place, what is our vision? What is it we're looking for? What's the public sector money that we're going to leverage? And what do you get if you bring more in, bringing all those developers together? I'm doing a lot of work with the East Midlands DevCo at the moment, and I think that kind of development corporation model is potentially really promising for being able to do that and bring that sort of that kind of larger scale development planning together. Because I think unless we work collaboratively, as you say, David, we've got to work together collaboratively. Otherwise, it's just a kind of petty battle over who can basically offer the least. And it needs to be all about how we can all bring the most to what we're doing.
Jocasta, do you have any, before I go back to David? He's really on it today.
I think from our perspective, again, it will surprise you not that I'm going to say data, because David mentioned visibility. If you've got visibility of the business case, visibility of the outcomes, it provides confidence in the sector. And I think we can all agree that large infrastructure projects don't get the best press when it comes to public sector spending. So I think if you can provide the data and you can manage that whole kind of supply chain effectively, efficiently, and give that visibility to both ministers and to the private sector, then you're able to give confidence. And that's where we come in, from our digital supply chain twins that we're building. We're doing one with a rail company in Canada at the moment, because they recognise that actually doing business with them is really difficult for their customers. So they want to provide their customers with that visibility, with that confidence, to get more freight onto their trains. And I think using those kinds of technologies will provide that confidence and that visibility to the sector as a whole.
Thank you. I think let's have a look at some of these Slido questions. So I like this one. The trouble is, government is absolutely clueless how local government works, and the relationship with developers who use viability at every turn. I'm not even going to be drawn. Here we go. Nice controversial one. Panel. Can national road user charging, just wait for the silence, provide funding and the stick to get more confidence in investment in public transport? Ooh. Claire, go on. You've got that face that says, right, I'm all over this.
Yes, well, those of you that know me know that I am a road pricing specialist. I started in congestion charging originally. I've worked on numerous pricing schemes, so I'm slightly biased, I guess. But, I mean, I think some form of national road pricing is coming in the long term, realistically. The government stands to lose 5% of its total tax revenue from the transition to EV. So that hole is going to have to be plugged somehow. We're seeing countries all across Europe already starting to investigate different road pricing type options. We're working in Australia, we're working in the Netherlands. New York is looking at road pricing. I think its time is coming. However, realistically, its time needs to be now, because now is when we're doing this huge transition on the road network, and we need to be thinking about it. given the cost of living crisis that people are facing, it could not be a worse time to be talking about how we pay for things, and we need to be incredibly realistic about that. I think the work that TfN have done on understanding connectivity and social exclusion is so important. It's something that we talked a lot about in the early days of congestion charging, and was talked a lot about in the years of the social exclusion unit in the government. And if we don't get that right, you know, it's easy to be glib and say that it's coming, but it could be a disaster for huge numbers of people who rely on the car. And, you know, it needs to come, but it needs to come in the right way.
Chikaste, did you have a review?
Again, it needs to come back to that evidence base, doesn't it? And it needs to ensure that you're taking into account all of the evidence and not just the evidence that kind of suits the arguments that you're wanting to go for. So ensuring that you're gathering all of that data in one place, and that the data it's fine gathering data. You can gather data points for everything, but as long you've got to ensure that it's robust, and you've got to ensure that the bias is also taken out of the questions that you're then asking of that data. So all of that needs to be taken into account.
Oh, do you know, I was going to do the decent thing, Andy, and I wasn't going to come to you, but you put your hand up.
I couldn't rely on that, Rupert, so I thought I'd better get the retaliation in first. So, well, like many of us, I've had a couple of goes at road pricing, congestion charging in my career as well, and I think if you look, it's Chikaste's point, if you look at what has bedeviled previous schemes, be they national or regional, it is understanding the impact and what the data is telling us, what insights we can gain on sections of the community, and arming politicians at whatever time is the right time. And my sense is this is not the right time because of the cost of living crisis having spun up. Arming politicians with the ability to be a bit braver and a bit stronger, but I think that comes from deep insight into the impact of schemes on individuals.
Thank you, Andy. David, quickie.
Yeah, I was just going to perhaps, you know, from a delivery perspective, we all know that, you know, the technology's available, it's in use, the investment models are there and all that type of thing. But there's a great book out there from a guy called Simon Sinek, those of you on LinkedIn, Start With Why. I think probably, you know, from a UK perspective, back to that piece earlier around looking at the broader piece, the social economy and the environment discussion around it, and why is it appropriate for the UK?
Look, thank you, panel. I mean, that's been a great discussion. We could have gone for hours, which would have probably, you'd have all walked out. A really good discussion. I mean, a lot of emphasis on partnership and relationship, data, help us understand, you know, users. I'm really interested, Chikaste, in the moonshots and taking a risk and doing new things. And I think it's really important for us to hear, actually, that this isn't just a group of people sitting on beanbags saying, here's an idea, let's go off and do it. There's a real structured process around evidence to your board to take those decisions. Look, it's going to be pretty challenging, isn't it? We're, what, 18 months or so away, anybody's guess, to a general election and change and uncertainty and constraint. You know, it's the world that we live in. It's the world that the public sector, I think, has done well in the last 10 years. We might not have liked it, but we've dealt with it, and we've given best outcomes that we possibly can. So I think we're in a good place. I think that you all pick this up, but not one individual can do it singly. It needs to be us as a collective, and it's about how we develop and forge those partnerships and be clear on risks, be clear on outcomes. And Chikaste, coming back to your point, it's not been lost, that data again, you know, the data and evidence. So, amazing panel. Thank you very much. Chikaste, Claire, David, and Andy. Thank you.